The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and it was written in the kind of careful, polished language that people use when they want to deliver devastating news without appearing to enjoy it. Margaret Hollis, director of the Frontier Placement Agency in St. Louis, had sent it herself. Silas Mercer read it, standing at his kitchen table, still in his coat, snow melting off his boots onto the floorboards. The message was brief. A woman named Evelyn Hart had been dispatched from Philadelphia. She would arrive in Cheyenne on the Friday train. She was a widow. She had 4 sons. Silas read that last sentence 3 times. He had asked for a housekeeper. He had filled out the agency's form in October, paid the placement fee, and written clearly, in his own hand, 1 woman, capable, no dependents required. He had not asked for a family. He had not asked for children. He had specifically, deliberately, and in writing, asked for none of those things. And yet, here was Margaret Hollis, in her careful penmanship, informing him that a widow with 4 boys was already on a train heading toward his ranch, believing, because the agency had told her so, that she was coming to be a wife. Silas set the telegram down on the table. He looked out the window at the gray sky pressing down over the pasture. The first serious snow of the season had come 2 nights ago, and it hadn't let up much since. The temperature that morning had been cold enough to make the water in the barn trough freeze solid by dawn. He picked the telegram up again and read it 1 more time, as though the words might have rearranged themselves into something more manageable. They had not. He put on his hat and went back outside. Before you ride any further into this story, if something in these first few moments already has you leaning forward, already wondering what Silas is going to do when that train pulls in, then you're exactly where this story wants you. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it's already gotten under your skin hit, like, now let's go back to Wyoming, and let's see what happens when the wrong woman gets off the right train. Silas Mercer was 41 years old, and he had spent the better part of the last 3 years learning how to live in a house that felt too large for one person. His wife, Clara, had died in the spring of 100,881 from a fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. She was gone in 11 days. Silas had been in the north pasture when it happened, checking fence line after a bad storm, and by the time he rode back, the house was already quiet in the way that told him everything before he even got through the door. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't see the point. Clara was gone. The ranch still needed running, and Wyoming winters had no patience for grief. But by the following October, he had burned through 2 hired women who quit within weeks of arriving, one because of the isolation, one because of the cold, and one because of Silas himself, though nobody said that out loud. His nearest neighbor was 11 miles south. The town of Larkin was 18 miles east. The ranch sat at the base of a long ridge, half sheltered from the worst wind, surrounded by scrub and open pasture, and the kind of silence that some people found peaceful and others found unbearable. Silas found it normal. But he was also, by November of 1883, down to dried beans, hardtack, and the specific kind of domestic disorder that accumulates when a man has been cooking for himself for too long. The pantry was a disaster. The kitchen stove needed new blacking. There was a crack in the chimney mortar that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing. The house wasn't falling apart, exactly, but it was listing. It needed someone who knew what they were doing in it. So he'd contacted the agency, filled out the form, paid the fee, and now, apparently, the agency had decided that what he actually needed was a wife and 4 children. He spent Thursday night sitting at the kitchen table with the telegram in front of him, working through his options. He could send a return wire to Cheyenne and tell the station master to inform the woman when she arrived that there had been a mistake, that she should go back. He could simply not show up. He could show up, explain the situation calmly, give her enough money to cover her return fare, and consider the matter closed. All of those options felt reasonable, All of them, when he tried to hold them in his mind past the first 30 seconds, felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite explain. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. He was back up before 4. The Cheyenne Depot was louder than Silas liked. He'd tied his horse to the post outside and stood near the edge of the platform, watching the train come in from the east, trailing its plume of smoke across the pale winter sky. It was cold. His breath made small clouds in front of his face. He'd pulled his hat down against the wind, and he kept his hands in his coat pockets and his expression flat, because that was how Silas Mercer generally faced things he wasn't sure about. The train slowed. The brakes shrieked. The platform filled with the noise of people and baggage and shouted greetings, and Silas stood still in the middle of all of it, watching the passenger car doors. She came off the second car. He knew it was her before she'd taken 3 steps, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the way she was moving, that particular combination of exhaustion and alertness that belongs to people who've been traveling for days and can't afford to look tired. She was carrying a cloth bag over one shoulder and had a small boy's hand in her other, and behind her came 3 more boys in a rough staircase of height, the oldest one maybe 14, carrying a trunk on his own without being asked. Silas watched her scan the platform. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently, the way a person's do when they've learned to assess situations before committing to them. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't crying. She was looking for whoever was supposed to be there to meet her. And when her gaze landed on Silas, on a man standing alone near the platform edge, not rushing forward, not waving, she held it there for a moment. He made himself walk toward her. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "Not a question, Mr. Mercer," she said. Also not a question. Up close, she looked like someone who hadn't had a decent night's sleep in about 3 weeks, but was refusing to let that become anyone's problem. She was around 35, maybe a little older, with dark hair pulled back and a coat that had seen 2 or 3 winters already. Her eyes were steady. She didn't smile, and she didn't look away. "I think," Silas said. "There's been a misunderstanding." "I think so too," she said. "I was told you were seeking a wife. I was seeking a housekeeper." There it was. He said it plainly, and she heard it plainly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the depot continued around them. A porter calling out, a child crying somewhere to the left, the hiss of the train's cooling engine. The agency's letter said wife, Evelyn Hart said. Her voice was even, but something shifted in it, not breaking. Exactly. More like a door being held carefully shut from the inside. "I know," Silas said. "I've seen their letter. It says wife." "My form," said housekeeper. "They made a mistake." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her boys, lined up behind her in the cold, the oldest one still holding the trunk, the youngest one leaning against her leg. She looked back at Silas. "We've been on a train for 4 days," she said. "I know that too. I told my sons we were coming to a home." Silas heard that. He felt the weight of it clearly, because it wasn't an accusation, it was just a fact, stated without decoration, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not going to leave you standing on a train platform in December," he said. "That's not what I'm going to do." She watched him like she was deciding whether or not to believe that. He got the impression that Evelyn Hart had been told reasonable-sounding things before that turned out not to be reasonable at all. "Then what are you going to do?" she said. Silas looked at her boys again. The oldest one was watching him with an expression that had more wariness in it than any 14-year-old should have been carrying. The second boy had a book tucked under his arm and wasn't looking at anyone. The third was staring at the train. The little one had his face half buried in his mother's coat. "Come back to the ranch," Silas said. "All of you. It's 18 miles, and if we don't start soon, we'll be driving in the dark. We can figure out the rest of it when we get there." She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. "Boys," she said, and that was enough. They gathered themselves without being told twice. The drive back was quiet in the way that silences are when everyone has too much to think about. Silas drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench, her back straight, her hands in her lap. The four boys rode in the wagon bed behind them, and after the first mile or so, Silas heard the little one fall asleep, and the sound of his slow breathing was the clearest thing in the cold air. He tried to work through the problem as he drove. He had paid the agency a placement fee for a housekeeper. The agency had sent him a widow with 4 children and apparently told her she was getting a husband. The only person in this entire situation who had done what they were supposed to do was the woman sitting beside him. And she was now riding into the Wyoming winter toward a ranch she'd never seen, with 4 boys who thought they'd found somewhere to stay. It was a mess. It was a genuine, thorough, unreasonable mess, and it was not his fault, and it was not her fault, and that fact made it more complicated rather than less. "How old are they?" he asked, because he needed to say something, and that seemed like the least loaded question available. "Jonah is 14, she said. Caleb is 11. Owen is 9. Finn just turned 6. Silas did the arithmetic. The oldest boy had been 11 when his father died, assuming the man had been dead a few years. The youngest hadn't been old enough to remember much. He didn't ask about the father. That wasn't his business. "Can Jonah work?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, with an expression that might have been measuring. "He already does," she said. "Has been since he was 12. Silas nodded and looked back at the road. They rode in silence for another mile. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was picking up from the north. "I need a housekeeper," Silas said finally. That part was real. The kitchen's in poor shape. The pantry needs reorganizing. There's 6 months of winter in front of us, and the last 2 women I hired didn't last a month. I'm not saying it's a pleasant situation. I'm saying it's an honest one." Evelyn looked at the road ahead for a moment. "I know how to run a household," she said. "I did it for 11 years. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I didn't think you were." "Then we understand each other," she said. He wasn't sure they understood each other at all, actually, but it was a start. The ranch came into view just as the last light was going out of the sky, a collection of dark shapes against the ridge, the barn larger than the house. A single lamp burning in the kitchen window that Silas had left going before he'd set out that morning. He heard one of the boys shift in the wagon bed. "Is that it?" someone said softly. "Owen, maybe. Or Caleb." Nobody answered. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. He could feel the temperature dropping by the minute. He got down and went to the wagon to help with the trunk and found Jonah already had one end of it. "You take that side," the boy said to him, not impolitely, just practically. Silas took that side. They got the trunk inside. Evelyn went through the front door ahead of everyone, and Silas watched her move into his kitchen, the way he'd watched her move through the depot quickly, taking in what was there, filing it. He could see her eyes go to the stove, to the shelves, to the state of the table. He could see her register the cold inside the house, which wasn't much warmer than outside, because the fire had burned down to coals while he'd been gone. She didn't say anything about any of it. She set her bag on the table, turned to the stove, and started getting the fire going. "Jonah," she said, "get the kindling from outside. Owen, find out where the water's kept." Caleb, she paused, looked at Silas. "Where are the extra blankets?" Silas pointed. "Back bedroom, shelf above the door." "Caleb," she said, and Caleb went. Finn stood in the middle of the kitchen, still in his coat, looking up at the ceiling as though he were trying to decide what to make of it. Silas noticed the boy had dark circles under his eyes that no 6-year-old should have. "There's a cot in the lean-to," Silas said, to no one in particular. "It'll need a blanket, but it holds fine. Boys can sleep in there tonight if they want their own space." Evelyn glanced at him. Something in her face shifted very slightly, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "That'll do," she said. Later after supper, a thin soup she'd put together from what she found in his inadequate pantry, which was nevertheless the best meal Silas had eaten. In several weeks he sat across from her at the kitchen table while the boys settled into the lean-to. Finn had gone quiet. Jonah had gotten him down onto the cot without any fuss. "I need to write to the agency tomorrow," Silas said. "Yes," Evelyn said. I want you to understand I'm not going to put you and your boys out in December. That's not going to happen, regardless of what the agency says. She had both hands around her coffee mug and was looking at it rather than at him. I appreciate that. But the situation has to be settled, officially. She nodded slowly. I understand. Silas looked at the table. The arrangement you thought you were coming into, that's not something I can offer. I should be clear about that. I know, she said. She didn't sound wounded by it. She sounded like a woman who was too tired to be wounded by anything tonight and would decide how she felt about all of it in the morning. I'm not interested in arrangements I didn't ask for. What I'm interested in is a stable situation for my children. That's fair, Silas said. Is it stable here? She asked, not challenging him, actually asking. He thought about the crack in the chimney mortar. He thought about the north pasture fence that needed attention before spring. He thought about the fact that this house had had no particular warmth in it for 3 years, and that the lamp in the window that morning had been the only thing burning in it that wasn't strictly necessary. It can be, he said. She looked up at him then and held his gaze for a moment. He'd expected more from her, more questions, more negotiation, more visible calculation of risk. Instead, she just nodded once. Then we'll see, she said. She finished her coffee. She said goodnight. She went to check on the boys. Silas stayed at the table for a while longer, listening to the wind come off the ridge, and to the house which had stopped feeling quite as empty as it had that morning, though he couldn't have said exactly when that had happened. He didn't try to explain it. He just sat there in the lamplight and let it be what it was. Outside, the snow had started again. The snow had not stopped by morning. Silas was up at 4:30, the way he always was. And when he came downstairs, the kitchen was dark and cold, and exactly as it had been the night before, except that it wasn't, quite because someone had washed the supper dishes and stacked them neatly beside the basin, and the kindling box had been refilled and set flush against the wall, instead of sitting sideways in the middle of the floor where he'd left it for the better part of a month. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at that. Then he got the fire going and put the coffee on and went out to the barn. When he came back an hour later, Evelyn Hart was already in his kitchen. She had found the apron. He kept on the back hook Clara's apron, which he hadn't touched in 3 years, and she was wearing it over her dress without ceremony. Standing at the stove with her sleeves pushed up, working something in the cast iron skillet. The smell of it hit him the moment he opened the door. Bacon fat and onion, and something with cornmeal. His stomach responded before his brain did. You don't have to do that, he said. Old habit. He'd said the same thing to the last 2 hired women, and they'd both taken him at his word and done progressively less until they left. Evelyn didn't look up from the skillet. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm doing it. He took off his coat and hat and sat down. He didn't say anything else. She set a plate in front of him 4 minutes later. Cornmeal cakes, what was left of the bacon, and 2 eggs that she'd clearly found somewhere in the back of the larder. He ate without talking, and she moved around the kitchen behind him with a kind of efficient quiet that reminded him painfully, briefly of the way Clara used to move in the mornings before the day started. He pushed that thought back where it came from and focused on the food. The boys came in from the lean-to in stages. Owen first, already alert and curious, looking around the kitchen, as though he were memorizing it. Then Caleb, carrying the book he'd had under his arm the day before, which turned out to be a worn agricultural almanac that Silas had left on the shelf in the lean-to and forgotten about. Then Jonah, who ducked his head slightly, coming through the doorway, even though he had at least 2 inches of clearance, a habit of a boy who'd spent time in low-ceilinged spaces. Finn came last, and he came slowly, with his blanket still dragging from one hand, his hair going in 4 directions. He stood in the kitchen doorway and blinked at Silas with the particular blank expression of a child who is not yet fully awake and is not entirely sure where he is. Sit down, Finn, Evelyn said, without turning around. Finn sat down. He looked at Silas across the table. Silas looked back at him. Are those your cows? Finn said. Yes, Silas said. How many? 43 head, give or take. Finn, appeared to consider this with great seriousness. "That's a lot of cows," he said. "It is," Silas agreed. Evelyn put a plate in front of Finn. The boy looked at it, then looked at his mother, and whatever he saw in her face made him pick up his fork without complaint. Silas had a feeling that food at their table in Philadelphia had sometimes been a more complicated matter than it appeared this morning, and he left that alone. After breakfast, Silas expected to go out to the barn and leave the household situation to sort itself out. He was halfway through pulling his coat on when Evelyn said, without particular emphasis, "I'll need to know where everything is." He stopped. "The root cellar," she said. "The smokehouse, if you have one, where you're keeping what's left of the flour. I counted 4 different storage areas last night from what I could see, and I don't want to spend a week figuring out which one has what." Silas thought about his pantry. He thought about the state it was in, the disorganization of it. Things stored without system labels he'd stopped reading. 2 sacks of cornmeal he'd pushed to the back that he'd bought in September and forgotten. He'd been managing. That was the most generous word for it. "I'll show you," he said. He spent the next 40 minutes walking her through every corner of the food storage on the property. She didn't comment on the disorder. She asked precise questions: how often he got to town, what the road was like in heavy snow, whether the nearest neighbor had a working smokehouse she could trade access to if his ran short. She had a small notebook, which she'd produced from somewhere, and she wrote things down in it with a pencil stub that she kept behind her ear. By the end of it, Silas had the distinct and slightly unsettling feeling that he was the one being assessed, not the other way around. "You're short on salt," she said, standing in the root cellar with her lantern, looking at his shelves. "I know. You'll need at least 3 times this before February." "I know that too. Then why—" She stopped herself. Started again. "When are you next going to town?" "End of the week, maybe. Depends on the snow." She nodded and wrote something else in her notebook. Silas looked at the shelves and tried to see them the way she was seeing them, and, for the first time, felt a twinge of something that might have been embarrassment at what they showed about how he'd been living. "I'll make a list," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly, as though the state of his root cellar was just a problem to be solved, same as any other. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. By mid-morning, Jonah had followed Silas to the barn. He hadn't asked. He'd simply appeared in the barn doorway while Silas was working on a bridle that had needed repair for 2 weeks, stood there for a moment, and then come inside and picked up the other bridle hanging on the nail beside it and started looking it over with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked with leather before. Silas watched him out of the corner of his eye. The boy was quiet. That was the first thing. He wasn't talking to fill the space, wasn't trying to make himself useful in a way that announced itself. He just found work and did it. When he didn't know something the right tension for the stitching, how Silas wanted the throat latch adjusted, he asked one direct question, and then did it the way Silas told him without revisiting it. After about 20 minutes, Silas said, "You've done this before." "My uncle had horses," Jonah said. He didn't elaborate. "Your father?" A pause. "He worked at a mill," Jonah said. "He didn't know much about animals." Silas took that as the full answer it was and went back to the bridle. They worked side by side for another hour, without saying much. The barn was cold but out of the wind, and the horses shifted and breathed around them, and the light came in thin and gray through the high windows. At one point, one of the mares got restless and started moving against her stall, and Jonah stood up and went to her without being asked and put his hand flat against her neck and just held it there until she settled. Silas watched that. The boy had steady hands. Steadier, probably, than his age explained. Silas thought about what Evelyn had said the night before he already does. Has been since he was 12. He thought about what it cost a boy to become the kind of steady that Jonah was, and how much of the cost you could see in a boy's face if you looked at it straight. He decided not to look at it straight. That wasn't his business yet. "You can come out here in the mornings," Silas said when they were finishing up, "if you want." Jonah glanced at him. "Brief, careful. Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing. Feed, water, checking the stock. It's not light work in the winter. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then my mother would need to know where I am. That's right, Silas said. Tell her before you come out. Jonah nodded. He hung the repaired bridle back on its nail and straightened it until it sat even. Then he went inside without making a production of anything, and Silas stood in the barn listening to the sound of his footsteps cross the yard and the kitchen door open and close. He stood there for a minute longer than he needed to. Then he got on with the rest of the morning. What Evelyn did to his kitchen that afternoon was not gentle. She didn't ask permission. Silas came in from the north fence, which had a section down that he'd been nursing along with wire and stubbornness, to find every shelf in his pantry cleared, every item sorted into groupings on the kitchen table, and Evelyn standing in the middle of it all, with her notebook and a look of concentration that suggested she had been at this for hours and was not close to done. He stood in the doorway and looked at his kitchen table, which currently held 2 years of accumulated provision chaos. Invisible, organized rows. I'm going to need more shelf space, she said without preamble. There's a board in the barn, he said after a moment. Is there something to fix it to the wall with? I've got nails. Then I'll need nails in the board. Silas got the nails in the board. He spent the next hour putting up an additional shelf in the pantry, and Evelyn stood 2 feet behind him the entire time, telling him exactly where she needed it, not the height he'd assumed. 3 inches lower, because the flour sacks wouldn't clear a higher one, and she had measured the sacks. Of course she had, and Silas, who had not had anyone tell him where to put a shelf in his own house in 3 years, found to his mild surprise that he did not particularly mind. By the time the shelf was up, and she'd begun restoring order to the pantry, it was late afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and the faint vinegar smell of her cleaning the shelves before she put anything back on them. Caleb had been in and out twice, once to ask his mother something about the almanac, and once apparently for no reason at all, except to check on the progress of the pantry, which he seemed to find genuinely interesting. Owen had discovered the water situation. The well was close, but the pump handle was stiff, and had spent an industrious 40 minutes figuring out how to work it before coming inside to report on its mechanical deficiencies to anyone who would listen. The pump needs grease on the rod, Owen told Silas. I know, Silas said. I could do it if you showed me where the grease is. Silas showed him where the grease was. Owen went back out. Silas heard the pump working 20 minutes later, smoother than it had been, and stood in the kitchen doorway, listening to it with a feeling he didn't immediately name. Evelyn was listening too, from her place at the pantry shelves. Her hands didn't stop moving, but her chin lifted slightly, the way a person's does when they hear something that confirms something they already knew. He takes things apart in his head, she said quietly. Always has. Machinery, problems, other people's arguments. He works out how they go together. Useful thing to know how to do, Silas said. It is, she said. She put a jar of preserved peaches on the new shelf, adjusted its position a 1/4 inch, and moved on. His father used to tell him it was too much thinking for a boy his age. Silas didn't respond to that. He wasn't sure what the right response was, and in his experience the wrong response to something like that was worse than silence. He was wrong about most things, Evelyn said simply, and left it there. Finn woke from a nightmare at some point in the night. Silas heard it through the wall, a thin, high sound that stopped after a moment, and then low voices, Evelyn's and the boys', the specific murmur of a mother talking a child back from somewhere frightening. It went on for a while. Silas lay in the dark on his side of the wall and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind off the ridge. He'd grown used to the sounds of an empty house. He'd grown used to the particular silence between 2 and 4 in the morning that was the loudest kind. He had not thought about that silence in any deliberate way, the way you don't think about a toothache until it's gone. It had just been the shape of his nights for 3 years. This was different. Not comfortable, exactly. Not yet, but different. He heard Evelyn's voice go quiet eventually, and then nothing, and he guessed the boy had gone back to sleep. He stayed awake a while longer, listening to the house settle around the new weight of 6 people instead of 1. And then he slept too. The routine established itself without anyone planning it. That was the thing Silas noticed over the following week. It didn't happen because anyone sat down and organized it. It happened because Evelyn had an instinct for logistics, the way some people had an instinct for music, and because the boys had clearly been living within structure for long enough that they moved into the available shape of each day without being pushed. Jonah was in the barn by 6 every morning, having told his mother. Silas stopped being surprised to find him there. He started leaving things for the boy to begin on feed, to measure out, stalls to check because Jonah did them right the first time, and asked when he didn't know something rather than guessing and making a mess of it. Caleb spent most of his indoor time with the almanac, and after 2 days, silenced him watching the sky in the mornings with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing what he was seeing against what he'd read. He didn't talk much, Caleb. He observed. He listened to conversations he wasn't technically part of and occasionally said something precise and unexpected that suggested he'd been processing the whole time. Owen fixed the pump and then fixed the latch on the barn's secondary door, and then identified that one of the wagon wheel hubs was wearing unevenly and mentioned it to Silas with the casualness of someone who wasn't sure if they were allowed to notice. Silas told him he was right and watched the boy try and fail to suppress a look of satisfaction at that. And Finn was 6 years old and asked questions at a rate that should have been exhausting but somehow wasn't, because the questions were genuine, not performance, not attention-seeking, just the raw, ongoing curiosity of a child encountering a world that was larger than the one he'd come from. He wanted to know about the horses by name. He wanted to know why the snow was deeper near the barn than near the house. He wanted to know what Silas's middle name was, and when Silas told him it was William, Finn nodded seriously, as though this confirmed something. "My middle name is Arthur," Finn said. "That's a good name," Silas said. Finn seemed pleased by this. He went away and reported it to Owen, and Silas heard Owen tell him that not everything needed to be reported, and Finn tell Owen that this did. Silas wrote to the agency on the 4th day. He sat at the kitchen table, after supper, when Evelyn had taken the boys to the lean-to and the house was quiet, and he wrote the letter carefully, crossing out 3 versions before he had one he was satisfied with. He told them there had been an error in placement. He told them the nature of the error. He told them that the situation was currently stable and that he expected a response explaining what the agency intended to do to correct it. He did not tell them. He was uncertain about wanting it corrected. He sealed the letter and left it on the table and went to bed. In the morning, it was still there, and he looked at it while he drank his coffee, and then he put his coat on and took it to town. The road was bad, rutted ice under new snow, and it took him nearly 2 hours to cover 18 miles. He left the letter at the postmaster's, bought the salt and a few other provisions from Evelyn's list, and started back. The sky was pressing down, flat and colorless, and the temperature was dropping steadily by the time he turned back onto the ranch road. He thought, during that drive, about what the agency's reply might look like. They would likely offer Evelyn another placement. That was the agency's business, placing women, finding situations, managing the logistics of relocation. They might offer her traveling money, a letter of introduction, a new arrangement in some other town with some other widower who had asked clearly for a wife. They would tidy up the mistake and close the file. The thought sat in his chest with a specific, unpleasant weight, and Silas turned it over several times on the drive home, examining it honestly. He had not expected them to matter. That was the truth of it. He'd made a practical decision, bringing them back, instead of leaving them at the depot, and he'd made it because abandoning a woman and 4 children in a Wyoming December was not something he was capable of doing. Not because he'd wanted a family in his house. He hadn't wanted that. He'd made that clear to himself and to Evelyn both. But they had been here for 4 days, and something had shifted in the house. Something structural and hard to describe, The way a room changes temperature, not from a single fire being lit, but from accumulated warmth that has nowhere to escape. He thought about Finn, sleeping through the second night. Evelyn had mentioned it to him in passing the following morning. Matter-of-factly, he slept all the way through, didn't wake once, and the way she'd said it, carefully not making too much of it, told him everything about how uncommon that had been. He thought about Jonah in the barn, working with his head down and his shoulders, finally, incrementally, beginning to drop from the position they'd been in when he'd carried that trunk off the train. He turned the wagon into the ranch road, and the house came into view, lamplight showing in the kitchen window, smoke from the chimney getting caught and pulled sideways by the wind. It looked, from the outside, exactly the way a house with people in it looks. He hadn't realized he'd been looking at an empty one long enough to forget the difference. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when he came in, mending something by the lamp. She looked up when he opened the door and let the cold air in with him. "Salt," she said. "4 bags. Good." She looked back at her work. "Owen wants to talk to you about the wagon wheel. He's been waiting." Silas shed his coat and hung it up. Owen materialized from the lean-to doorway approximately 4 seconds later with the specific contained energy of a 9-year-old who has been patient for several hours and is running low. "The left front hub," Owen said. "I looked at it closer. The bore's worn on the inside face. If you don't replace the bushing before spring, the wheel'll go loose on a bad road." Silas looked at the boy. Then he sat down at the table and said, "Show me." Owen produced a small sketch on a piece of paper, accurate, clear, completely unsolicited, showing the hub in cross-section with the worn section indicated by a line. Silas looked at the sketch for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary. "Where'd you learn to draw like this?" he said. Owen shrugged. "I just draw what I see." Silas folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "I'll get the bushing next time I'm in town. You can watch me replace it if you want." "I could help," Owen said. "You can watch first," Silas said. "Then we'll see." Owen clearly found this unsatisfying but acceptable. He went back to the lean-to. Evelyn, without looking up from her mending, said, "He already knows he could do it himself." "I know he does," Silas said. "That's not the point." She glanced at him then. "Brief. Considering he needs someone to teach him the right way," Silas said, "not just confirm he's right." Something in her expression shifted. "Not much, just enough." "No," she said. "He does need that." She went back to her mending. "Thank you." Silas poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, which was still hot because she'd kept it there for him, and he sat at his own kitchen table and felt the accumulated warmth of the house around him and didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The cold that came at the end of the second week was a different order of cold than what had come before. Silas woke to a temperature that had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and when he opened the back door, the air hit him like something solid. The kind of cold that got into wood, into water lines, into the joints of older animals. He was in the barn by 4:45. Jonah was there 10 minutes later, hat pulled down over his ears, looking at the horses with the same assessing attention Silas was giving them. "Mare in the second stall is off," Jonah said. "She was restless all night. I heard her." Silas looked at him. "You were awake?" "Off and on," the boy said, not making anything of it. They checked the mare together. She wasn't in crisis, but she was uncomfortable, the cold, probably, and the pressure of it. Silas made adjustments to her feed and added extra bedding. And Jonah worked alongside him without being directed, reading the situation and responding to it. And at one point, when Silas needed a second pair of hands, the boy was already there before Silas could ask. After, when the mare was settled and they were working their way through the rest of the morning barn chores, Silas said, "You don't sleep much." Jonah was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just finding the right words. "I'm used to listening," the boy said finally. "In Philadelphia, in the building we were in, you had to. You'd hear things in the hall or downstairs, and you needed to know what they were." He paused. Old habit. Silas understood. The boy had been the listening post, the one who stayed aware so the others could sleep. "You don't need to do that here," Silas said. "I know," Jonah said. He said it in the same tone you use when you know something intellectually but haven't felt it yet in your body. The tone of someone who will believe it eventually but can't be rushed. Silas let it go. He'd said what he had to say. The rest would take whatever time it took. They worked through the rest of the barn chores in companionable silence, and the cold held outside, and the animals settled. And by the time they went back inside, Evelyn had the kitchen warm and breakfast on the table, and Finn was already awake and talking about the horses, specifically by name, specifically in more detail than anyone had provided him, which meant he'd been reading the tags on the stall boards. He knows the horses' names already, Caleb said, not looking up from where he was sitting near the window, watching the morning sky. I told you I did, Finn said. You told us. I wasn't sure if you actually did. I did, Finn said with dignity. Silas sat down at the table and looked at the 4 boys and the woman who had come to his house by mistake and ate his breakfast, and the day started the way the previous days had started, which was imperfectly, and with too much to do, and with enough warmth in it to make the imperfect parts bearable. He thought about the letter sitting at the postmaster's in Larkin, waiting for a reply. He thought about it, and then he put his fork down and reached for the coffee. And he let the thoughts sit without solving it, because there wasn't anything to solve yet, and because the kitchen was warm, and because Finn was explaining to Caleb the precise hierarchy of which horse was which, with a conviction and authority that a 6-year-old had no business having, and the sound of it filled the room in a way that the room had not been filled in a very long time. Outside, the wind hit the north wall of the house and found no way through. Inside, the fire held. The agency's reply arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Silas had sent his letter. He almost missed it. He'd gone to town for feed, and the salt he'd promised Owen he'd get, and the postmaster handed him 2 envelopes, along with a parcel of wax twine he'd ordered in October. One envelope was from the harness supplier in Denver. The other had the Frontier Placement Agency's return address printed in clean block letters on the upper left corner. Silas put both envelopes in his coat pocket and drove home without opening them. He wasn't sure why he waited. It wasn't that he was afraid of the letter exactly. It was more that he understood, in a wordless and practical way, that whatever was inside it would require him to make a decision, and that once the decision was made, it couldn't be unmade, and that the drive home with the letter still sealed in his pocket was the last stretch of time in which things were still uncomplicated. He pulled up to the barn. Jonah came out to help with the feed. Before Silas had even set the brake, the boy had heard the wagon on the road, had heard it and known it was Silas, and had simply come out, because that was what Jonah did now. He didn't announce himself. He just showed up where he was needed. They unloaded the feed sacks together without talking much, stacking them along the barn wall in the order Silas preferred, heaviest at the bottom. When they were done, Jonah brushed the grain dust off his hands and said, "Caleb thinks the temperature's dropping again tonight. Says the cloud pattern's been reading that way since noon." "He's probably right," Silas said. Jonah nodded and went back inside. Silas stood in the barn for another minute, one hand resting on the top feed sack, listening to the horses. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the agency's envelope, and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written in the same careful hand as the telegram. Margaret Hollis expressed her regret for the confusion. She outlined the agency's position that the error was clerical, that the woman assigned to Silas's file had misread the original intake form, that the agency took full responsibility. She explained that they were prepared to offer Mrs. Evelyn Hart an alternative placement in the town of Garfield, a day's ride east, where a schoolmaster had recently lost his wife and was seeking a capable woman to manage his household and assist with his 3 younger children. The position came with a private room, a small wage, and the possibility of a teaching arrangement for Mrs. Hart herself, should she prove suitable. The agency would cover the cost of transportation. All Silas would need to do was inform Mrs. Hart of the opportunity, provide her with a copy of the letter, and notify the agency of her decision within 30 days. Silas read it twice, standing in the cold barn with the horses shifting around him. Then he folded it along its original creases and put it back in his pocket. He stayed in the barn for 20 minutes longer than he needed to. He did not tell Evelyn about the letter that evening. He told himself it was because there was no good moment. Supper with Finn explaining something about the differences between the three horses' personalities, which he had apparently been cataloging with the rigor of a naturalist, and Caleb correcting him twice on details, and Owen eating with the focused efficiency of a boy who'd been outside in the cold all afternoon and had worked up a serious appetite. By the time the table was cleared and the boys were settled, Evelyn was mending by lamplight with the quiet concentration she gave to everything she did, and Silas sat across from her with his coffee and the folded letter in his coat pocket, and the knowledge that as soon as he told her, something would irrevocably change. He drank his coffee. He looked at the fire. "You're quiet," Evelyn said without looking up from her mending. "I'm usually quiet," he said. "You're quieter than usual," she said. He had nothing to say to that because it was accurate. He said good night and went to bed and lay in the dark with the letter on the nightstand and the wind working at the shutters, and he thought about Jonah coming out of the barn without being called, and about Owen's sketch of the wagon hub folded in his other coat pocket, and about Finn sleeping through the night for the third time running. He thought about the schoolmaster in Garfield, and his 3 children, and his private room, and his small wage. He thought, she would take it. He thought, she should take it. It's a better situation. Stable wage, a town, a teaching position. Everything a woman in her position should want. He thought, I don't want her to take it. He acknowledged that last thought clearly, without flinching from it, because Silas Mercer was not a man who lied to himself even when the truth was inconvenient. He lay with it for a while. He went to sleep eventually. He got up at 4:30, the way he always did, and went down to the kitchen. The letter was still on the nightstand. He'd left it there, deliberately. He told her after breakfast, when the boys were out. Jonah was in the barn. Caleb had gone to the lean-to to read. Owen had announced his intention to examine the south fence line on foot, which was either genuine initiative or an excuse to walk around in the cold, and Silas had decided it didn't matter which. Finn was asleep. He still took a short nap after breakfast most days, though he would have violently denied this characterization. Silas put the letter on the table between them. Evelyn looked at it, then at him. "From the agency," he said. She picked it up. She read it the way she did everything, quickly, precisely, her face showing nothing beyond concentration. He watched her eyes move down the first page, turn to the second. When she finished, she set it back on the table with the same deliberateness with which she'd picked it up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Garfield," she said. "It's a real town. I've been through it twice. It's got a church and a schoolhouse and a proper main street. A schoolmaster," she said. "That's what it says." She looked at the letter again, though she didn't pick it up. "It says teaching position may be available." "May be," Silas said. "That's what it says." She was quiet. He watched her think, and he knew better than to fill the silence, because Evelyn Hart did not appreciate having her thinking filled in for her. He had learned that in 3 weeks. "When do they need to know?" she said. 30 days, she nodded. Another silence. Then she looked at him directly, the way she had at the depot, that straight, assessor's gaze that he'd come to recognize as the face she wore when she was deciding whether or not to trust something. "What do you want?" she said. It caught him sideways. He hadn't expected her to ask it that directly. "That's not," he started. "Don't tell me it's not your decision," she said. "I know whose decision it is. I'm asking what you want. Because you sat on that letter overnight and then told me about it after the boys were out of the house, and you're not a man who does things accidentally." Silas looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "I want you to stay," he said. "All of you." He said it plainly, the way she said things, without decoration. Not because the kitchen needed someone. Not because of the arrangement. Because the house, he stopped. Searched for the right word and found it inadequate. Because it's different now. With all of you here. She held his gaze. He could see her processing it, not dismissing it, not running from it, just turning it over carefully, the way she turned everything over. That's honest, she said finally. I'm trying to be, he said. I know. She folded her hands on the table. I need to think about it. I know that too. And I need to think about it without pressure, from you or from anyone. That's fair, Silas said. 30 days. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she stood up and began clearing the rest of the breakfast dishes. And that was the end of the conversation. And Silas understood that she meant what she said, that she would think about it, and that the thinking was hers alone, and that he would have to wait. He was not a patient man by nature. He had learned patience the way most people did, by being repeatedly required to exercise it until it became less painful. He put his coat on and went out to the barn. The week that followed had a particular kind of tension in it, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes the quality of every ordinary thing. Silas noticed it mostly in small ways. He was more careful with his words. He paid attention to Evelyn's face in a way he hadn't allowed himself before, reading it for indication of which direction she was leaning, and coming up mostly empty because she was careful with her face, the way he was careful with his words. She didn't seem to be pulling back. She ran the household with the same efficiency she'd brought from the first day, reorganizing, planning, managing, teaching the boys the rhythms of the ranch in small ways, showing Finn how to check if the water pump had frozen by the sound it made, showing Owen how to read the smoke from the chimney. She was fully present. She was also, he sensed, somewhere else part of the time, in the place where she was turning his words over and weighing them against everything else she had to consider. He respected it. It also drove him quietly out of his mind. Jonah noticed something was different, though he didn't know what. He was a boy with a good sensor for atmospheric shifts, and on the third day he came to Silas in the barn and stood for a moment with a brush in his hand, working over the bay mare's shoulder, and then said, "My mother okay?" "She's fine," Silas said. Jonah absorbed this. "She gets quiet when she's working something out." "I know. She'll be like this for a while, probably." "I know that, too." Jonah went back to brushing the mare. Then, after a minute, "Is it about us staying here?" Silas kept his eyes on the harness he was repairing. "That's something to ask your mother." The boy was quiet for a long time after that. He didn't ask again, but he worked alongside Silas for the rest of that morning, with more focus than usual, tighter, more deliberate, the way people get when they're trying to hold something together by the effort of their own will. Silas noticed. He said nothing about it, but he noticed. It was Caleb who said the thing that broke open the week. He was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the almanac open in front of him alongside a piece of paper he'd been writing on, and Silas was at the other end of the table, going over some figures in his account book, and they'd been sitting in companionable silence for about 40 minutes, when Caleb said, without looking up, "I've been working out the spring planting." Silas looked at him. "Based on the temperature patterns," Caleb said. He turned the paper around so Silas could see it. It was covered in careful notes, dates, temperature ranges drawn from the almanac data, projected frost dates. "The south field gets the most sun in March and April. I think you could get a kitchen garden started by late April, if the winter breaks the way the last 3 winters did." He paused. "My mother would know what to plant." Silas looked at the paper for a long time. It was not an aggressive piece of paper. It was just a boy's notes, written in a neat, slightly formal hand, working out a spring that was 4 months away. A spring that assumed they would still be here. "You've been thinking about spring?" Silas said. "I've been thinking about it since November," Caleb said. "I think about things ahead. Jonah says I worry too much, but I think it's better to work it out before you need to." "You're right about that," Silas said. Caleb nodded, satisfied in the way he was satisfied when someone confirmed something he'd already worked out. He turned the paper back around and wrote something else in the margin. Silas went back to his figures. He got through 2 more lines before he set his pencil down and just sat there looking at his account book without seeing it, because what he was actually seeing was Caleb sitting across this table in April and Jonah in the barn learning how the spring calving worked, and Owen taking apart whatever needed taking apart, and Finn getting tall enough to stop ducking under the water pump handle. He saw all of it so clearly it felt less like imagination than like memory, like something that had already happened, that he was only now being told about. He picked his pencil back up. His figures didn't balance, and they weren't going to balance staring at the middle distance. And Caleb had gone back to his notes with the serenity of a boy who had said what he needed to say and was content to leave the rest where it lay. 12 days after the letter arrived, Evelyn told Silas she'd written to the school board in Millhaven. He was in the kitchen filling his coffee cup when she said it. He turned around. Millhaven, he said. It's 14 miles west. I rode past the turnoff last week when I went with you to Larkin. She was at the stove, adjusting the damper. She didn't turn around either. They have a school. It operates 8 months, closes in the worst of winter. The current teacher is the minister's wife, and she's been doing it alone for 6 years. You wrote to them, Silas said. I wrote to the school board asking whether they had a need for another teacher, a part-time arrangement possibly. She paused. I haven't decided anything. I wanted to know what was available. He looked at his coffee. He understood what this meant. Not that she was leaving. Not yet. But that she was gathering information the way she gathered everything, methodically, and without committing until she had the full picture. Millhaven's closer than Garfield, he said. It was not an argument. It was just a fact. Yes, she said. Roads passable in most weather, except the worst 3 or 4 weeks. Yes, she said again. He sat back down at the table. So you're still thinking? She turned then and looked at him. She had flour on her hands from something she'd been working on earlier. I have 4 sons, she said. The oldest one is 14, and he's already more man than boy, and he doesn't have a father, and he's been carrying weight that no boy his age should carry. The second one thinks about the future 6 months ahead and is afraid, though he won't say so. The third one is good at everything with his hands and has never once had a man show him how to do something right instead of just doing it for him. And the youngest one cried every night for 8 months after his father died, and he has slept through the night every night since we got here except twice. Silas sat with that. I know what it looks like when my children are taking root somewhere, Evelyn said. I've been watching for it because I have been wrong before about which place would be the right one, and I am not willing to be wrong about it again. And, Silas said, she looked at him for a long moment. Her hands with the flour on them were still at her sides. And I'm still thinking, she said, but I'm not thinking about Garfield anymore. She turned back to the stove. Silas sat at the table and drank his coffee and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. The letter from Millhaven came back faster than either of them expected 9 days, which meant the school board had discussed it and responded without much deliberation. The chairman of the board, a man named Gerald Pratt, wrote that they were indeed interested in discussing an arrangement. He noted that Mrs. Hart's references from Philadelphia, which she had apparently enclosed with her letter, were more than adequate. He proposed a meeting in the new year at her convenience to discuss terms. Evelyn read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while Silas was in the barn. When he came in, she had it in front of her and was looking at it the way she'd looked at the agency's letter with that measuring, processing stillness. She handed it to him when he sat down. He read it. It was a good letter. Clear, respectful, specific. Gerald Pratt seemed like a man who ran his school board the way Caleb would have run a school board efficiently and without waste of words. It's a good offer, Silas said. It's a preliminary conversation, she said. It may not come to anything, but it might. She nodded slowly. It might. He put the letter on the table between them. What does it mean? If it does come to something. I don't know yet, she said. It depends on the terms. How many days? Whether they'd want me in the town, or whether I could be at the ranch during the week and go in. She stopped herself. He saw her hear what she'd said. At the ranch. Neither of them pointed to it. The word sat there on the table, alongside the letter. You've been thinking about how it would work, Silas said. Not whether. She met his eyes. I've been thinking about both, she said carefully. I don't want to think I've decided something before I've actually decided it. That's fair, he said. You've been patient? She said abruptly. It surprised him. He looked up. I know this has been hard to wait on, she said. You said what you said, and then I needed time, and you gave it without... She made a small gesture, without pressing. I wanted to say that. Silas looked at the table. It's your decision, he said. It would have been wrong to press. Most men would have anyway, she said, not bitterly. Just as a statement of the way the world had generally operated in her experience. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she picked up the Millhaven letter and folded it with the same care she gave to everything, and set it aside. I need to tell the boys, she said. He felt something tighten. About the agency letter? About all of it. The letter from the agency, the letter from Millhaven. She looked at him. They're old enough. Jonah is old enough for certain. He knows something's happening. Caleb probably has it half worked out. And if I make a decision without telling them what I was deciding, Jonah will never forgive me. She was right about that, and Silas knew it. He'd watched Jonah these past weeks. The boy watched everything, filed everything, and had the particular sensitivity of someone who'd been lied to by omission before, and had learned to distrust gaps in information. You want to tell them tonight? He said. Not tonight. I need to think about how. She folded her hands on the table. But soon, Silas nodded. He stood up, took his coffee cup to the basin. He was almost to the door when she said his name. He turned. The thing you said, she said. About the house being different. With us here. She was looking at the table, not at him. It's different for me, too. I want you to know that. He stood in the doorway. The lamp was behind her, and he couldn't read her expression clearly, but he didn't need to. All right, he said. He said it quietly. It was all he had, and it was enough. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the house, which was warm and occupied and pulling at its corners with the weight of 6 lives instead of 1. And he thought about spring, the way Caleb thought about spring practically, concretely, with specifics that implied a future already being built. He thought about Caleb's paper, the frost dates, the south field, the kitchen garden. His mother would know how to plant. He thought, 30 days. I've got 18 left, he thought. She said, at the ranch. He let that settle. He closed his eyes. Jonah found out 2 days before Evelyn intended to tell them. Silas didn't know how. He suspected Jonah had seen the agency letter on the table at some point before Silas had put it away, or had caught some fragment of conversation that he'd filed and returned to and worried at until it told him something. The boy had that quality. Nothing slipped past him entirely. Things just waited in him until they made sense. He came to Silas in the barn on a Thursday morning. He came in and started working without saying anything, the way he always did, but after about 10 minutes, the quality of his silence changed. Silas felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before you can name what's different. The agency wrote, Jonah said. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was checking the hay level in the corner stall. Didn't they? Silas set down what he was holding. Yes. Jonah's shoulders tightened, and they want us to go somewhere else. They offered another placement, Silas said. Your mother's deciding. When she has until the end of the month. A long silence. Jonah put more hay in the stall, even though it didn't need it. He was doing it to have something to do with his hands, and Silas recognized that, because he did it himself. What do you want her to decide? Jonah said. I already told her what I want, Silas said. It's her choice. Jonah turned around then. He was looking at Silas directly. With that face, he had the one with the extra 10 years in it, the one that had been making Silas uncomfortable since the first day. Not because it was unpleasant to look at, but because it was a window onto something that should have been allowed to close at a certain age and hadn't been. Caleb's been talking about spring, Jonah said. He talks about things like we're going to be here. He doesn't know what's happening. Your mother's going to talk to all of you soon, Silas said. Owen thinks this is our home, Jonah said. He said it quietly, like a wound he was showing, not for sympathy, but because he needed it acknowledged. He told me last week. He said he thinks this is it. This is where we're going to be. And Finn. He stopped. I know, Silas. said. Finn hasn't had a nightmare in 2 weeks, Jonah said. Not one. He said it the way you say the thing you've been carrying longest, the thing that has the most weight. He was having them every night before, every single night since our father for over a year. And since we got here, he's sleeping. Silas stood very still. I'm not asking you to fix this, Jonah said. He straightened. He was not asking to be managed or reassured, and Silas could see it. He was stating facts, the way his mother stated facts, without decoration. I'm asking you to… He stopped again. His jaw worked for a moment. I'm asking you to tell me honestly, because I need to know how worried to be. Silas looked at the boy for a long moment. 14 years old, and asking to be told the truth about whether his family was about to be uprooted again, with the specific dignity of someone who has run out of the luxury of not knowing things. I want you here, Silas said. I've told your mother that. She's thinking about a teaching position in Millhaven that's a separate thing, her own work, not related to the agency's offer. She's thinking about staying, Jonah. She hasn't said it in those words, but she's thinking about it. Jonah absorbed this carefully, but she hasn't decided. No, she hasn't decided. The boy looked down at the barn floor. He nodded once. He picked up his work again, going back to the stall, and they worked in silence for a while. Then Jonah said, without turning around, in the spring, can I learn to ride the bay mare? Not just lead her. Ride. Silas's throat did something odd that he ignored. Yes, he said. We'll start in April when the ground's better. Jonah nodded. He said it like he expected to still be here in April. He said it like a boy who has allowed himself, carefully, and with full knowledge of the risk, to expect something good. They finished the morning chores and went inside, and the cold came with them on their coats. And Evelyn looked up from the stove and looked at Jonah, and then at Silas and said nothing, because she read the room the way she read everything else. And she understood that something had been settled between them that she didn't need to ask about. She put breakfast on the table. Finn was awake, talking about the horses. Caleb was by the window, watching the sky with the almanac open in his lap. Owen was explaining something about the pump mechanism to no one in particular. Silas sat down at the table that had been his alone for 3 years, in the house that had been too large for one person, and he poured his coffee, and the day started, and he let himself think just briefly, just once about April. Evelyn told the boys on a Friday evening, 3 days after Jonah had come to Silas in the barn. She waited until supper was finished and the dishes were cleared, and then she asked them to sit back down at the table, all 4 of them. Silas started to push his chair back to give them the room, and she said, "You stay too," without looking at him, and he stayed. She told them plainly. The agency had made a mistake. The placement had been wrong from the beginning. Silas had asked for a housekeeper, not a wife, and she had been sent here under false information. The agency had since offered her another situation in Garfield, with a schoolmaster there, and she had also written to the school board in Millhaven about a teaching position. She had 30 days to give the agency her answer. She said all of it without softening it, without the particular kind of adult dishonesty that disguises hard things in gentle language to protect children from the shape of the world. She said it the way she said everything directly, with respect for their ability to hear it. Finn didn't fully understand. He sat with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands and watched his mother's face for cues about how worried to be. Owen went very still in the way he went still when he was running calculations. Caleb looked at the table, and Silas saw his throat move and remembered what Caleb had said about thinking 6 months ahead and being afraid, though he wouldn't say so. Jonah looked at nothing in particular, his face arranged into the careful blankness he used when he was containing something. "What's Garfield like?" Owen said. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "I've never been there. Is it far?" "A day's ride east." Owen looked at Silas. "Is it a good town?" "I've passed through it," Silas said. "It's a real town. Bigger than Larkin." Owen nodded, filing that. "What about Millhaven?" Caleb said. He was still looking at the table. "That's closer." 14 miles, Evelyn said. "That's close enough to come back," Caleb said. He said it quietly, and he said, "Come back," as though the ranch were already the fixed point, and the school would be the temporary destination. And Silas heard it, and so did Evelyn. And she looked at her second son for a moment, with an expression that was too complicated to name. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm just saying it's close enough." Finn raised his hand, the way he apparently did in whatever schoolroom he'd attended in Philadelphia. It was such an out-of-place gesture at a kitchen table that it broke something in the room. Owen made a sound that was almost a laugh, quickly suppressed, and even Jonah's blank expression shifted. "Finn," Evelyn said, "you don't need to raise your hand. Are we going to have to leave?" Finn said. Evelyn looked at her youngest. He was 6 years old, and his eyes were very direct, and he was asking the only question that actually mattered to him, stripped of every qualification and context that the older boys had dressed it in. "I don't know yet," she said. "I don't want to leave," Finn said. Simply. "No performance in it, I know," Evelyn said. "The horses know me now," he said. "Even the bay one. She used to not like me, and now she does." "That's because you kept going back," Silas said, before he'd decided to say anything. Finn looked at him. "She's getting used to me," he said with satisfaction. "She is," Silas said. Finn seemed to consider this sufficient evidence for something. He looked at his mother. "So we should stay," he said, "because the horse is getting used to me." Jonah made a short sound through his nose. The scene. Owen looked at the ceiling. Caleb finally looked up from the table, and there was something unlocked in his face that hadn't been there a minute ago. Evelyn said, "Go get ready for bed, Finn." "But Finn!" He went, but he went slowly, dragging his feet with theatrical reluctance, which told Silas he wasn't actually that worried a genuinely frightened child doesn't perform. He'd been frightened before and knew the difference. The older boys stayed at the table for a few more minutes. Nobody said much. Eventually, Jonah stood up and said good night, and Owen and Caleb followed, and Silas and Evelyn were alone in the kitchen with the dying fire and the remains of the evening. "That went better than I expected," Silas said. "Finn helped," Evelyn said. She almost smiled. "He usually does." Caleb's weather prediction came true 4 days later. He'd said it at breakfast quietly. To no one in particular, the way he delivered most of his observations, that the barometric pattern over the last 48 hours was reading, like the big storm of 2 winters ago, the one that had buried the Larkin Road for 11 days. He'd said it with the almanac open beside his plate, comparing notes he'd been keeping in the margins since the 3rd week of their arrival. Silas had looked at the sky that morning and thought Caleb was probably right. He'd spent the day moving stock, checking the barn's supply of feed, reinforcing the lean-to-roof where one of the boards had been loose since October, and filling every available container with water before the pump had a chance to freeze solid. He'd worked straight through until near dark. Evelyn had spent the day in parallel filling the kitchen's water supply, doubling the wood stack inside, cooking ahead. When Silas came in at dusk, she had 3 pots on the stove and the look of someone who had been working since he left and wasn't close to finished. They didn't talk much. There wasn't the need for it. Each of them knew what the other was doing and why, and the work had a shared logic to it that didn't require discussion. The storm hit at midnight. Silas heard it come the wind, picking up first, then the sound of it changing pitch against the shutters, then the percussion of ice against the north wall. He was up and dressed before the sound had fully settled into a roar. He got downstairs to find Jonah already at the kitchen door, coated and booted, looking out at the black and white chaos of the yard, with the lamp held up and his face set against the cold that was pouring through the 2-inch gap. "Stock," Jonah said. Silas said. They went out together. What followed was 3 hours that Silas would not have wanted to put into words afterward, not because they were beyond words, but because the effort of it was the kind that didn't benefit from description. The wind was coming from the northwest, with a force that made walking a matter of leaning and holding and moving in the gaps between gusts. The snow was not falling so much as traveling sideways, and visibility between the house and the barn dropped to nothing in the worst moments. They navigated by feel and by the rope. Silas had strung between the two buildings. In November, he hadn't told anyone why he'd done it, and no one had asked. But now it was the difference between getting to the barn and getting lost 8 feet from the door. The animals were frightened. The horses were moving against their stalls. The cattle in the adjacent pen, pressing together in the corner, furthest from the wall, taking the most wind. Silas and Jonah worked through them, methodically checking injuries, adding bedding, reinforcing the latch on the barn's north-facing door that was taking the worst of it, redistributing feed to keep the animals occupied and moving enough to stay warm. At one point, a section of the barn roof made a sound that brought both of them up short. They stood listening. The sound didn't come again. They went back to work. Jonah was not a boy who panicked. That was the thing Silas noticed. In the spaces between tasks, not with relief, exactly, but with the specific recognition of someone who knew what panic in a crisis cost and was grateful not to be managing it. The boy moved with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, adjusted when conditions changed, and asked clearly when he didn't know something, which wasn't often. Around the second sea hour, when they were working to shore up the secondary pen, where 2 of the younger cattle were isolated, Jonah misjudged a footing in the dark and went down hard on one knee. Silas got to him before he could push himself up a reflex. Quick hand to the boy's arm, and Jonah accepted the help without ceremony and got back up and kept moving. "You all right?" Silas said. "Fine," Jonah said. He was favoring the knee slightly. He didn't stop. They worked another 40 minutes. Before, the immediate crisis was as managed as it was going to get that night. The barn was as secure as they could make it. The animals had settled into the specific, stoic endurance of creatures that have ridden out bad weather before and know there is nothing to do but wait. They made their way back to the house along the rope. The kitchen was lit and warm, Evelyn at the stove with coffee on, and her face showing a particular kind of relief when they came through the door that she didn't bother to conceal. She looked at Jonah's knee immediately. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine," he said for the second time. "Jonah," she said in the tone that was not a request. He sat down. She looked at the knee bruised, not broken, the kind of damage that would be stiff for 3 days and then forget itself. She didn't make a fuss of it. She wrapped it with a strip of cloth she produced from somewhere, told him to keep off it for the rest of the night, and went back to the stove. Silas sat down across from Jonah and accepted the coffee Evelyn put in front of him. The warmth of it moved through him, the way warmth does when you've been cold long enough to forget what you were before it. They sat in silence for a while. The storm continued outside, enormous and indifferent, and the house held against it. It was another hour before Evelyn sent Jonah to bed. He went without argument, which told Silas how tired the boy actually was under the composure. Owen had been awake. They'd heard him moving in the lean-to at some point during the storm, and had apparently gotten Caleb and Finn settled again without being asked. Caleb had woken and checked the window and gone back to sleep, according to his own nature. Finn had slept through the whole thing, which was the particular miracle that it was. When the lean-to was quiet and it was just the 2 of them, Silas and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with what remained of the coffee, and the storm worked at the house, and neither of them spoke for a long while. It was Silas who broke it. He hadn't planned to. He'd planned vaguely to finish his coffee and go check the north wall, and then sleep for whatever hours were left before the animals needed attention again. The night had been long, and the cold had loosened something in him. The same way cold sometimes does strips away the particular social varnish that makes people careful about what they say. "I want to tell you something," he said. Evelyn looked at him. She was tired. She had the worn, functional look of a woman at the end of a very long day who is still doing what needs doing, and her hands were wrapped around her mug, and she was watching him with those direct eyes. "What I said before," Silas said, "about wanting you to stay. I want you to understand what I meant by it." She waited. "I didn't say it because the house needed managing, or because your boys have been useful, or because it's been practical." He looked at his coffee. "I said it because this house was quiet in a way that wasn't right. for 3 years. And I'd gotten used to it, the way you get used to things that aren't good for you, because getting used to them is easier than admitting what's wrong. He stopped, started again. The first morning I came down, and the kindling box was moved, and the dishes were done. I stood there looking at it for a full minute, because it looked like someone lived here. And I hadn't realized how much it didn't look like that before. Evelyn was very still. I'm not talking about housekeeping, Silas said. I know that's what the arrangement was. I know that's how it started. He looked up at her. I'm talking about Jonah coming out to the barn in the dark, without being asked. I'm talking about Finn telling me his middle name, like it was important that I knew it. I'm talking about the fact that I've had Caleb's paper with the spring planting notes in my coat pocket for 2 weeks because I didn't want to put it somewhere and forget it. He stopped. That's what I meant. When I said I wanted you to stay, that's the whole of it. The wind hit the north wall. The lamp flickered. Evelyn set her mug down. She looked at the table. Then she looked at him with the most unguarded expression he'd seen on her face since she'd stepped off that train. Not happy, not sad, more like a person emerging from behind, a thing they'd been holding in front of themselves for a long time. I'm afraid, she said. He hadn't expected that. Not that word, stated that directly. Of this? He said. Of choosing wrong again, she said. I chose wrong once. I married a man who seemed steady and turned out to be he wasn't cruel. I want to be fair to him. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was wrong for us in ways that took too long to become obvious. And by the time they were obvious, there were 4 children who had only ever known that life. She paused. I am not good at being wrong about things that matter this much. Nobody is, Silas said. I know, but most people haven't had to watch their children pay the cost of it. She looked at him steadily. What you said about the house feeling like someone lives here, I feel that too. I want you to know that I'm not unmoved by it. I'm not sitting here untouched, deciding this from a distance. She shook her head slightly. I have not been untouched by any of this. Silas looked at her. But I need it to be right, she said. Not just good enough. Not just better than the alternative. Right. Because Jonah is watching, and Caleb is calculating, and Owen is already planning his spring projects, and Finn is teaching your horse to tolerate him, and I cannot bring them to this table again in 6 months and tell them we have to start over. I know, Silas said. Do you? Yes, he said, I know. And I'm not going to tell you it's certain. I can't promise you certainty. Nobody can promise you that. He held her gaze. But I can tell you that what I want is for all 5 of you to be here, not for a season, not while it's convenient. Permanently, he paused. That's what I want. I've known it for a while. I'm saying it plainly because you asked for honesty, and that's the honest thing. The storm pushed at the house. The fire held. Evelyn was quiet for so long that Silas thought perhaps the conversation was over and began to think about standing up. Then she said, Jonah is going to need someone to teach him how to run a ranch, not just work one, how to manage the accounting, how to assess livestock, how to negotiate at the stockyard. He has the mind for it. He's never had access to anyone who knew how. I know how, Silas said. I've been doing it for 15 years. I know you have, she said. Then that's settled, he said. If the rest of it is. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stood and took both mugs to the basin and rinsed them, and she said, I need to sleep. So do you. The animals are going to need work in the morning. They are, Silas said. Then we should sleep. He nodded. She moved toward the hallway and then stopped, her back still to him, her hand on the doorframe. I'm going to write to the school board in Millhaven next week, she said, to confirm the meeting. He understood what that meant. He understood it completely. All right, he said. She went to bed. He sat at the table for a few minutes more, listening to the storm, finding no way through the walls, and then he went to check the north side of the house, and came back and turned the lamp down and went to bed himself. Jonah's knee kept him out of the barn for 2 days. He did not handle this gracefully. He sat at the kitchen table with the almanac and Caleb's weather notes and contributed observations from the window with the focused dissatisfaction of a person doing something useful while thinking. about the more useful thing he could not currently do. Caleb tolerated this with his characteristic patience. Owen, who had no patience for enforced stillness on principle, had taken over Jonah's barn responsibilities with a seriousness that Silas privately found gratifying. On the second day, when the storm had broken and the sky had cleared to the particular hard, bright blue that follows a big Wyoming blow, Silas came in from the barn and found Jonah at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, working on something. He sat down across from him. Jonah turned the paper so Silas could see it. It was a list of the cattle by the ear tag numbers Silas used, with notes beside each one: condition as of last week, estimated weight, which ones were due to drop calves in spring, which ones had been off their feed during the storm. Silas looked at it. It was accurate, all of it accurate from memory, over the course of 2 days, compiled without Silas's record. "How do you know the tag numbers?" Silas said. "I memorized them," Jonah said, as though this were not remarkable. Silas looked at the list again. 43 animals. All of them? "I have a good memory for numbers," Jonah said. He paused. "My mother says it's useful." "Your mother's right," Silas said. He handed the paper back. Jonah looked at it, then at Silas. "I've been thinking," Jonah said. His voice was careful, measured, about the stockyard. "You go in February, right? For the winter sale?" "Usually," Silas said. "I'd like to come with you. I'm not asking to do anything. I just want to watch how it works. How you talk to the buyers. How you decide what to sell and what to hold." Silas leaned back in his chair. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since the first week," Jonah said. He said it without apology, the way people admit to things that they've decided don't require apology. "Why didn't you ask sooner?" Jonah's jaw moved. "Because I didn't know if we were going to be here," he said. "In February." The directness of it landed the way Jonah's directness always landed, quietly, with more weight than the words suggested. "Come to the stockyard," Silas said. "February. We'll go together." Something crossed Jonah's face that was gone before it fully arrived. He looked back down at his list of cattle and made a small notation in the margin. "Thank you," he said. "It's practical," Silas said. "I know," Jonah said. "It's still thank you." Owen found Silas in the barn that afternoon. He came in without Jonah's quiet and without Finn's narrating, which meant he came in the way Owen always entered a space purposefully, already knowing what he needed and moving toward it. He had grease on his hands from something he'd been working on, and a question in his face that had been there for longer than this afternoon. "Can I ask you something?" Owen said. "You can," Silas said. "The wagon hub," Owen said. "The bushing we replaced. If the bore was worn on that wheel, it'll probably wear the same way on the right front. Same roads, same load distribution." He'd clearly been sitting on this for days. Should I check it now, or wait until it shows symptoms? Silas looked at him. 9 years old. Same roads, same load distribution. He was applying a principle, not just reporting an observation. "Check it now," Silas said. "What you can't see is always more dangerous than what you can." Owen nodded. He started to turn away. "Owen," Silas said. The boy turned back. "You're thinking like an engineer," Silas said. "That's not a small thing." Owen looked at him with the expression he wore when he received a compliment he was deciding whether to trust. He was 9, and he'd apparently learned at some point to approach good things the way you would approach a door that might be stuck with a little pressure first, before you commit your weight. "My father said I was always looking for problems," Owen said. "There's a difference between looking for home problems and thinking ahead," Silas said. "What you're doing is thinking ahead." Owen considered this with visible seriousness. Then he nodded again, once, and went to check the right front hub. Silas went back to what he'd been doing. He listened to Owen working outside, the careful sounds of him, and thought about what it cost a boy to learn to distrust his own competence, and what it cost to get it back. Finn found him at dusk. He came into the barn when the light was going orange and low, while Silas was finishing the evening water. He was wearing his hat pulled low the way he'd decided hats were supposed to be worn, based on watching Silas, and he had both hands in his coat pockets, and he walked with the serious stride of a small sergeant going somewhere important. He stopped beside Silas and watched him work for a minute. Jonah's knee is better, Finn said. Good, Silas said. He walked on it without limping tonight. Finn paused. I watched. I know you watched, Silas said. You watch everything. Finn accepted this without comment. He stood beside Silas for another moment, and then he went to the bay mare's stall and put his hand up on the door the way Silas had shown him, flat, low, letting her come to it if she wanted. She came to it. She put her nose against his palm and blew warm air across his fingers. She likes me now, Finn said. She does, Silas said. Because I kept coming back, Finn said. Repeating what Silas had told him at the kitchen table weeks ago, but repeating it the way you repeat something that has become true in a way you now understand. That's right, Silas said. Finn stood with the mare's nose in his hand for a little while longer. Then he said, Is my mom going to stay? Silas finished the water and set the bucket down. He crouched until he was closer to the boy's height, which wasn't all the way down, because Finn was getting taller than he'd been in December. I think she is, he said. He said it carefully because he believed it, but believing something, saying it to a 6-year-old as though it's settled, were different things. I can't promise it the way I'd promise you suppers at 6, but I think so. Finn looked at him with those direct, unornamented eyes. Do you want her to? Yes, Silas said. I want all of you to. You know that. Finn thought about this. The mare pushed at his palm again, looking for something, and he moved his hand to her cheek, and she tolerated it. Okay, Finn said, as though that settled it, as though Silas's wanting it and the mare tolerating him were together sufficient evidence that things would work out right. He had that quality, Finn, the ability to reach a conclusion and rest in it, without the older boy's layering of contingency and caution. Silas stood back up. He finished the barn and they walked back to the house together. In the cold dusk, the big man and the small boy, and the snow around them was the packed, crystalline snow that comes after a big storm, not soft anymore, but solid, holding its shape. The kitchen window was lit. The smell of supper reached them before they got to the door. Finn pulled the door open and went in ahead of him, announcing to the room that the horse definitely liked him now. And Caleb said he'd already known that for a week, and Owen said the right front hub was fine, and Silas could look at it tomorrow to confirm. And Jonah looked up from the table where he'd been writing and met Silas's eyes across the room with a look that held everything the two of them had said in the barn and everything that didn't need saying. Evelyn put supper on the table without ceremony, the way she did everything, and they sat down, all 6 of them, in the house that the storm had tested and not broken. Outside, the cold held. Inside, the warmth was the kind that accumulates from bodies and fires and days of ordinary living, piled one on top of another until the walls have absorbed enough of it to give it back. Silas ate his supper. Finn talked about the horse. The fire held. The letter to the agency took Evelyn 4 drafts. Silas didn't know this until later, until she told him, in the way she occasionally told him things about herself, sideways and without ceremony, as though she were leaving something on a table for him to pick up or not. She'd written the first draft the morning after the storm, when the cold was still packed hard against the north wall, and the yard was buried under 14 inches of new snow. She'd written it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up in the dark, with only the lamp and the fire for company. She threw that draft in the fire. The second one she wrote 2 days later. She got further with it, got through the opening, through the formal acknowledgement of the agency's offer, through the first sentence of her decision. Then she stopped and read back what she'd written and saw that it was the letter of a woman explaining herself to people who hadn't earned the explanation, and she threw that one away too. The third draft she started and abandoned within a paragraph. She said, when she told Silas about it later, that it had been too apologetic, that she'd been thanking them for the alternative placement as though she owed them gratitude for a mistake they'd made and she'd been required to navigate. The fourth draft was short. It said that the situation at the Mercer Ranch had been resolved to her satisfaction, that she was declining the Garfield placement, and that she considered the matter closed. She signed it with her full name, and she did not thank anyone for anything. She sealed it on a Thursday morning, set it on the kitchen table, and came to find Silas in the barn. He was checking the mare's left foreleg, which had been slightly warm. For 2 days, nothing serious, but the kind of thing that became serious if you left it alone. He heard Evelyn's step in the barn doorway and looked up. She was in her coat and her boots, and she had the letter in her hand, and she held it out toward him without saying anything. First, he took it. He looked at the front of the envelope. The Frontier Placement Agency, St. Louis. He looked at her. "I want you to mail it," she said. "When you go to town, when do you want me to go?" "Today," she said. "If the road's passable." He looked at the sealed envelope in his hand. "It's passable," he said. "I'll go this morning." She nodded. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, not quite finished. "I also wrote to Gerald Pratt," she said, "in Millhaven, to confirm the meeting. I said the first week of February, if that works with the stockyard trip." "I can do the stockyard the week after," Silas said. "Then we can go to Millhaven together if you're willing." She paused. "I'd like someone with me who knows the area, in case Pratt is someone I need a second opinion on." Silas looked at her. She looked back at him. There was nothing dramatic in either of their faces. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment that happens after the dramatic ones, when the decision has been made and what remains is just the ordinary work of living with it. "I'll drive you," he said. "Good," she said. She looked at the mare. "How's her leg?" "Warm but not swollen. I'll poultice it tonight. Let me know if you need help." She went back to the house. Silas stood in the barn holding the letter, and after a moment he put it in his coat pocket, in the same pocket where he'd been keeping Caleb's spring planting paper for 3 weeks, and he finished checking the mare's leg and then got the wagon ready and drove to town. He mailed the letter at the postmaster's. He stood at the counter for a moment after he'd handed it over, watching it disappear behind the partition, and he felt the particular stillness that follows an irrevocable action. Not relief exactly, not joy, just the clean, quiet sensation of a door being closed from the inside. He bought the supplies on Evelyn's list and drove home through cold that had eased by a few degrees. Nothing dramatic, just the first small hint that the winter was not, in fact, permanent. The boys found out that evening. Evelyn told them at the table again, the way she'd told them about the agency letter. She said she'd written to decline the Garfield placement. She said she was meeting with the Millhaven School Board in February about a possible teaching arrangement. She said they were staying. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Finn said, "I knew it," with the satisfied confidence of a boy who had decided weeks ago, based on a horse learning to tolerate him, that this was how it would go. Owen nodded once, deeply, the way you nod when something you've been calculating comes out the way you worked it out. Then he said he needed to check on the right front hub in the morning, because he'd been worried about it and wanted to verify his assessment, and Silas told him they'd look at it together, and Owen seemed satisfied with that and went back to eating. Caleb looked at his plate for a moment. Then he looked up at his mother, and the look held something that was too large for 11 years old, too large and too careful. The look of a boy who had been afraid of exactly this kind of news going the other way, and was now not sure what to do with the fact that it hadn't. "Okay," Caleb said. Just that. But his voice had a shake in it that he was working to control, and Evelyn reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, and he looked at the table, and that was that. Jonah said nothing for a while. He finished his supper. He helped clear the table, the way he always did. He stacked the dishes at the basin, and then he stood with his back to the room, looking out the dark kitchen window, and after a minute, he said, "Good." He said it quietly, to the window, to the dark outside. Not to anyone in particular. He said it the way you say the thing that costs the most to believe. Then he turned around and asked Silas if they could start the ranch accounting lessons before the stockyard trip, because he wanted to understand the numbers before he watched the transactions. Silas said yes. They started the following morning. The meeting with Gerald Pratt happened on a Tuesday in early February, in the school board's office above the hardware store on Millhaven's Main Street. Silas drove Evelyn there and waited in the wagon outside, with a horse blanket over his lap and a copy of last year's stockyard ledger he'd been reviewing. She was inside for an hour and 20 minutes. He went through the ledger twice and then put it down and watched the main street. Millhaven was a modest town tidier than Larkin, with a proper covered walkway in front of the shops and 2 or 3 buildings that suggested someone had brought real lumber in rather than using what the land provided. The school was at the far end of the street, a solid wood frame building, with 4 windows he could count from where he was sitting. He watched a group of children come out of it for a few minutes at mid-morning, and then go back in. Evelyn came out of the hardware store at 11:15. She walked to the wagon with her coat buttoned against the cold, and her face doing the thing it did when she was satisfied with something but not ready to advertise it. She climbed up to the bench. Silas gathered the reins. "Well," he said. 3 days a week, she said. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. There are 22 students, 2 grade levels mixed together. Pratt wants someone for the older students, specifically reading, arithmetic, some history. She paused. The wage is modest, but it's a wage. That works with the ranch schedule, Silas said. I know it does, she said. I told him I'd need to be back by 3 o'clock on those days, and he said the school day ends at 2:30 anyway. She was quiet for a moment. He was decent. Pratt. He didn't talk to me like I was an arrangement he was managing. He asked about my background, and he listened to the answer. That's how it should be, Silas said. It often isn't, she said, so it was worth noting. He turned the wagon toward the road home. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that has enough in it that it doesn't need filling. After a few miles, Evelyn said, I told him I'd start the first week of March. Silas looked at the road ahead. Does it feel right? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. It feels like mine, she said. That's close enough. He understood that. He understood it precisely, because he'd built a ranch on the same principle, not that it was perfect, not that it was easy, but that it was his, made by his choices, and what you built from your own choices had a different kind of weight to it than what you were given or what you fell into. Caleb's going to want to come see the school, Silas said. I know, Evelyn said. He already asked me last night. What did you tell him? I told him to wait until I'd seen it first. She almost smiled. He took that very badly. Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The horse moved steadily along the packed snow road, and the sky above them was pale blue and enormous, and the wind for once was coming from the south. February moved through its last 2 weeks with the particular restless energy that accumulates before things break open. Jonas sat with Silas every evening for an hour, going through the ranch accounts. He had the patience for numbers that some people have for music, the ability to hold multiple figures in his head at once, to see patterns in them, to ask the right question at the right point in the ledger, rather than waiting until he'd lost the thread. Silas had done his own accounting for 15 years in the solitary way of a man who has no one to explain it to, and the experience of explaining it to someone who was genuinely following, who pushed back when something didn't make sense, who said, wait, why does this column offset that one, with the focus of someone who needed to understand the principle? Not just accept the number was something he hadn't anticipated enjoying as much as he did. On the last Thursday of the month, they went to the stockyard together, Silas and Jonah, leaving before first light in the wagon with the 6 steers. Silas had decided to move at the winter sale. It was a 2-hour drive, and they talked intermittently about the cattle, about the market, about what factors moved the price on a given day. Silas explained what he looked for in a buyer. Jonah listened with the steady, filing attention that was his primary mode of engagement with new information. At the stockyard, Silas let Jonah stand beside him through every transaction. He didn't explain while it was happening he'd learned from the accounting sessions that the boy absorbed better by watching first and asking after. Jonah watched the way Silas read a buyer, the way he held his price, the way he walked away once, when the first offer was insultingly low, and waited until the buyer came back, which he did, which was the point. On the drive home, Jonah said, "You knew he'd come back." "I thought he would," Silas said. "There's a difference." "How did you know to think it?" "Because he'd already walked the pen twice." Buyers who aren't interested don't walk the pen twice. Jonah was quiet, processing. "So you were reading him before the negotiation started." "You always start reading before the negotiation starts," Silas said. "By the time someone's making an offer, it's already half decided." Jonah turned this over for most of the road home. When they were about 2 miles from the ranch, he said, "My father never taught me anything like this." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't grief either. It was just an observation, laid down carefully, like something he'd been carrying that he'd decided he could set at the side of the road. "No," Silas said. "I didn't know there was this much to know," Jonah said. "About running something. About making things work." "There's a lot more than this," Silas said. "We've barely started." Jonah looked at the road. "Good," he said. For the second time to no one in particular. Just the word, placed where it needed to be. March came in cold, and then, within a week, cold, with the suggestion of something else underneath it. The light changed, not warmer yet, but longer, arriving a few minutes earlier each morning, staying a few minutes later in the evenings, and the effect was subtle but cumulative, the way most important changes are. Evelyn started at the Millhaven school on a Monday. She was up an hour earlier than usual, and Silas had the horse ready before she came out to the barn, and she stood for a moment looking at the harnessed animal with an expression he couldn't read from where he was standing. "All right," he said. "Nervous," she said, which surprised him enough that he looked at her directly. She noticed. "I know," she said. "It's a schoolroom, not a cattle auction." "Being nervous doesn't need to make sense," he said. "It just needs to pass." She considered this. "That's useful advice." "It's all I've got," he said. He handed her the reins. "You know the road." "I know the road," she said. She drove herself. She'd been driving herself for 2 weeks. She'd told him she needed to be able to manage it in all weather, and she was right, and she'd become competent at it with the same matter-of-fact speed she brought to everything practical. He watched her turn onto the road and disappear behind the ridge, and he went back to the barn. She came home at 3:15. The boys were at the kitchen table. Caleb had been watching the road from the window for 20 minutes, which he denied, and Finn had stationed himself at the door with what he described as general purposes. She came in and took off her coat and sat down at the table, and they waited. 22 students, she said, 12 in the upper group, ranging from 10 to 15 years old. She paused. They tested me. The way students do, not badly, just to see what I'd do. There was one boy, 13, who decided in the first 10 minutes that he was going to be more trouble than he was worth. Another pause. By the end of the day, he'd corrected himself twice and apologized once, unprompted. Caleb said, "What did you do?" "I gave him a problem that was harder than he expected and waited," she said. "When he got stuck, I didn't rescue him. I just waited more." Caleb absorbed this. "Did it work?" "Today it did," Evelyn said. "Tomorrow is a different question." She got up and started supper, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of it. And Silas sat at the table and did not say what he was thinking, which was that she had looked, coming through that door, like someone returning to a home they'd gone out from. In the morning, the specific ease of someone who knows which coat hook is theirs, which chair, which window catches the afternoon light. He didn't say it. He poured coffee and drank it, and the day closed around them, and outside the first real hint of thaw was making the snowpack along the south eave start to drip. April came the way Wyoming Aprils came grudgingly, in stages, with setbacks. There was a late freeze in the first week that killed 3 days of warmth and sent everything back to winter for a stretch that felt punishing after the hint they'd had. Caleb had predicted it grimly 2 days before it arrived. He was not smug about being right. He was matter-of-fact about it, which was worse. But after that freeze broke, the ground began to change in earnest. The packed snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the matted brown grass underneath, and the mud came the deep, heavy Wyoming mud that made the yard a problem and the road a worse one, and even the mud was a sign of something, a signal that the cold had lost its argument. Evelyn started her kitchen garden in the second week of April. Because she'd been planning it since February, Silas had found her notes twice, both times on the kitchen table. Lists of what she intended to plant, and in what order and in what configuration relative to the south field's sun angle. She'd written to a seed supplier in Denver in January, enclosing the exact letter Caleb had helped her draft, because Caleb had insisted on reviewing the order list against his light and temperature projections, and had suggested 3 changes that turned out to be accurate. When the seed order arrived in early April, Caleb opened the package with the reverence of a person receiving something they'd had a hand in creating. He checked each packet against his list. Everything was there. Evelyn broke the south field ground herself, with Silas turning the earth alongside her. Owen built the border, framing 2 days of focused, precise work, the kind of project that suited him, something with right angles and measurable outcomes. Finn carried things. He carried them with great seriousness and careful steps, and he reported after each trip on condition of what he'd carried, which was more information than anyone needed, and which nobody asked him to stop providing. Jonah strung the fence line to keep the cattle from the garden plot. He did it without being asked, which was how he did most things, now not waiting to be directed, just reading what was needed and doing it, the way a person who has genuinely absorbed the rhythm of a place moves through it. On the Saturday, they finished the basic structure of the garden, all 6 of them, standing at the edge of the south field, looking at what they'd made. Silas, said Caleb, you want to say whether you think we got the location right? Caleb stood with his arms crossed, squinting slightly at the horizon the way he did when he was performing a calculation. Southeast corner will get shaded from about 3 o'clock onward. By the ridge, he said. I'd move the root vegetables to the northwest section. They'll handle the shorter sun better than the leafy things. I already planned for that, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. You put it in your notes. I put it in my notes, she agreed. Then you didn't need my input. I needed you to confirm it, she said. There's a difference. Caleb thought about this with the seriousness he gave to most things. Okay, he said, finally satisfied. Finn said the garden was the best garden he had ever seen, which was easy to say at 6 when you hadn't seen that many gardens, but he said it with such conviction that nobody saw a reason to qualify it. The sewing room door had been closed since Clara died. Silas had not opened it in 3 years. He'd walked past it every day it was between the kitchen and the back stairs. And he'd been aware of it the way you're aware, of a thing you've decided not to look at directly. It wasn't grief anymore, not exactly. It was more that the door had become a fixed part of the house's logic, the way closed doors do when they've been closed long enough. He opened it on a Sunday morning in late April, when Evelyn was at the school for a makeup session. She'd scheduled. Some of the older students had missed days during the worst of the winter weather, and the boys were distributed around the ranch doing their various things. He didn't plan it. He came down the back stairs, and his hand went to the knob without him deciding to reach for it, and the door swung inward, and there was the room. Clara's sewing things were still there. Her basket, her thread, the small table she'd kept by the window for the light. The room smelled of dust and old wood, and the faint cedar smell of the chest where she'd kept her cloth. Everything was where she'd left it, because he hadn't moved anything. He stood in the doorway for a while. He thought about Clara. He let himself do it fully, without the usual management. He thought about what she'd looked like at this window, in the mornings, and about the way she'd laughed at things that surprised her, and about the specific unreasonable speed with which the fever had taken her, 11 days, as though it had never been going to be a negotiation. He stood there and let the grief move through him, the way water moves through a crack, not because he wanted to feel it, but because there was apparently still some of it left that hadn't been expressed yet, and it had been waiting in this room for 3 years for him to come in and let it finish. He was there for maybe 15 minutes. When he came out, he left the door open. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table, and the house was quiet around him in the way it was quiet on mornings, when everyone was busy elsewhere. Full quiet, occupied quiet, the quiet of a house that had people in it who were simply not here at this moment. When Evelyn came home at noon, she walked through the kitchen and into the hall and stopped. She looked at the open door. She looked at Silas. He was at the table with his second cup of coffee and the stockyard ledger, and he looked up when she stopped. "I opened it," he said. She looked at the room through the doorway. She didn't go in. She looked for a moment, and then she looked at Silas. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. He thought about it. "I think so, yes." She stood there a moment longer. Then she hung up her coat and came to the table and sat down across from him. "Her things are still in there," he said. "I know. I could see. I'm not going to move them," he said. I don't mean I'm going to leave the room closed. I just mean her things aren't things I want to put away somewhere and pretend weren't hers." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "That's fair," she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that the light in that room is good in the mornings. You mentioned last week that the kitchen table doesn't have enough light for close work, and you've been mending things in the evenings that you could probably do in better light if you had a window." She was quiet for a moment, holding his gaze. "I'm not trying to replace anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know you're not," she said. "It's just a room," he said. "It should be a room someone uses." Clary stopped, started again. She was a practical woman. She would have thought leaving a room empty for 3 years was a waste. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'll move my mending basket in there," she said. "If that's what you're suggesting." "That's what I'm suggesting," he said. "Then I will." She stood, but not today. "Let it be open a while first." He nodded. She went to start lunch, and the door stayed open down the hall, and the room got its first real air in 3 years, and Silas drank his coffee and felt something settle in him that had been standing at an angle for a long time. May brought the calving. Silas had been through 11 calving seasons on this ranch, and none of them had been calm because calving was never calm. It was physical and unpredictable, and it happened on nature's schedule rather than anyone else's, which meant the middle of the night as often as not, and it meant long cold hours in the barn, and it meant losses some years that you absorbed and kept going. This year he had Jonah. The boy had Jonah, had been reading about cattle husbandry since February. Silas had given him 2 books from the shelf, and he'd gone through both of them with the almanac-level attention he gave to anything he'd decided mattered. He came into the calving season with the book's information already in him, and he came with hands that had spent 5 months getting steadier, and he came with the willingness to be in the barn at 2 in the morning without complaint, which was not nothing. They lost 2 calves. One in the first week, a breech presentation that fought them for 2 hours and still didn't make it. Jonah had been there for all of it, covered in blood and exhaustion, and when it was over, he sat against the barn wall for 5 minutes and said nothing, and Silas let him have those 5 minutes without filling them. The second was a twin, whose mother rejected it, and though they tried fostering and bottle feeding, the calf was weak from the start and lasted 4 days. Jonah took both losses seriously, not with drama, not with the performance of distress, but with the honest weight of someone who'd worked hard to prevent a bad outcome and hadn't been able to. He recorded both in the ledger himself: cause of loss, date, dam's tag number, notes on what had been tried, and he wrote it all down with the precision of someone who understood that records existed not to dwell on failure, but to prevent repeating it. 41 calves made it. Strong, noisy, knock-kneed, filling the back pen with the particular chaos of new animals finding their legs. Finn counted them every morning. He reported the count to anyone in earshot. He reported it with the gravity of a man whose job it was to know such things, and he was, as of early May, reliably accurate. On the last Saturday of May, Silas found Owen in the barn with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil making a drawing. It was not the wagon hub this time. It was the ranch, a bird's-eye sketch of the whole property. The house, the barn, the garden, the pastures, the fence lines, the well. He'd gotten the proportions roughly right, which meant he'd been pacing out distances at some point without telling anyone. The roads in and out were marked. The north ridge was indicated with cross-hatching. The south field had the garden plot marked in it with a small rectangle. Silas stood beside him and looked at it. "What's this for?" he said. Owen looked at it consideringly. "I wanted to see it all at once," he said. "It's hard to understand something. You can only see one part at a time." Silas looked at the drawing again. It was in its way accurate. It was the ranch as Owen understood it, not perfectly proportioned, not surveyor precise, but correct in the things that mattered, the relationships between structures, the flow of the land, the way everything connected. "We need a better fence on the east line," Owen said, pointing to a section of his drawing. "The posts are soft on the bottom. 2 of them moved in the freeze. They'll go in the next hard winter if we don't replace them." "I know," Silas said. "I've got posts ordered." "When do they come in?" "End of June if the supply wagon runs on time." "It usually doesn't," Owen said. "No," Silas said. "But you plan for when it does." Owen wrote something on his drawing. A note about the fence posts, probably. He filed everything, Owen. He filed it in lists and drawings, and the specific organized memory of a boy who'd decided early that the world made more sense when you tracked it carefully. "You're going to build things someday," Silas said. "Actual things. Structures." Owen looked at him. "I thought I'd help run the ranch," he said. "Not defensively. Just clarifying." "You can do both," Silas said. Owen thought about this. "Can you do both?" "You can do more than one thing," Silas said. "Most people decide they can't before they find out whether it's true." Owen looked at his drawing. He wrote something else. Then he said, "The garden's working. Mother's lettuces are already up. Caleb predicted they would be." "Caleb predicts everything," Owen said. "It's useful, but occasionally exhausting." Silas made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Owen rolled up his drawing and tucked it under his arm and went to find something else that needed his attention. And Silas stood in the barn for a moment, in the May morning light, which was real light now, warm and long and full of the season's intention. Silas proposed on a Tuesday evening in early June. He had not planned it for a Tuesday. He had not planned it for a particular day at all. In the way people plan things they've been thinking about. For a long time, the thinking had been long enough that the actual moment of saying it felt less like a proposal and more like completing a sentence he'd started in February. The boys were in the lean-to. The kitchen was quiet. Evelyn was at Clara's table in the sewing room. She'd moved her basket in there in April, as she'd said she would, and she used the room 3 evenings a week now, and the room had become hers in the way. Rooms become a person's when they're used without apology. Silas stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I want to ask you something," he said, but she put down what she was working on. She looked at him with the direct, waiting attention she gave when she understood something was being said in full. He said it plainly. He said he wanted her to stay not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement, but as his wife, and that he wanted to put the question to her formally, because she deserved to be asked formally, and because he didn't want there to be any ambiguity in what he was offering or what he was asking. He said it wasn't because the ranch ran better with her, in it, though it did. It wasn't because the boys had become something he couldn't now imagine the place without, though they had. It was because she was the specific person. She was precise and unsentimental, and more capable than most people he'd known, and more honest than most people he'd encountered, and that was who he was asking. He said he understood if she needed time. He said he wasn't going anywhere. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment, not the long, deliberate silences she'd used in the winter when she was genuinely processing, but the brief pause of a person who already knows the answer and has decided to say it. "I don't need time," she said. "I've been thinking about it since March." "And yes," she said. "That's my answer." He nodded. She looked at him, and then she did smile, which was not something she did often enough, that he'd stopped noticing it when she did. "Was there something else?" she said. "No," he said. "That was all." "Then come sit down," she said. "I want to finish this before the light goes." He came and sat. and she went back to her mending, and the sewing room was warm and lit and lived in, and the house around them was full of the sounds of the evening. Finn's voice from the lean-to, arguing pleasantly with Owen about something. Caleb's quieter responses, the particular rhythm of four boys settling into a night. He did not try to name what he was feeling, because some things are large enough that naming them reduces them, and he had learned this, slowly, over the course of a winter and a spring that had undone 3 years of a particular kind of loneliness. So gradually, he hadn't noticed it going until it was already gone. They were married in August, by the circuit judge who came through Larkin on his quarterly rounds. It was a small thing. Evelyn had not wanted a large event, and Silas had not either. The judge, a spare man named Aldrich, who married couples with the efficient warmth of someone who considered it the best part of his circuit duties, performed the ceremony in the front room of the ranch house on a Wednesday afternoon. The boys were there. Jonah stood straight and still in the good shirt Evelyn had made him, and his face for once was open, not the careful composure he wore most days, but something younger, something closer to the face he might have had if life had been gentler to him earlier. Caleb stood beside him, with his arms at his sides and his eyes bright, and he did not look down at the floor once. Owen watched the ceremony with the analytical attention he gave to things he found structurally interesting, which Silas chose to interpret as engagement rather than assessment. Finn wore his hat inside until Evelyn said his name, and then he removed it with dignity and held it at his chest for the rest of the ceremony with the seriousness of a guard at an important post. When it was done, when Aldrich had closed his book and shaken Silas's hand and told Evelyn she had excellent taste in both husbands and window light, there was a moment before anyone spoke in which the room held everything it had accumulated over 8 months, all the cold mornings and the difficult conversations and the letters and the storm and the calving season and the garden coming up and the sewing room door opening, and it held all of it without straining. Then Finn said, "Does this mean you're our father now?" The room went very quiet. Silas looked at the boy. Finn was holding his hat at his chest and looking up at Silas with the frank, direct eyes of a child who does not understand why the question might be complicated. Jonah said, "Finn, it's a real question," Finn said. Silas looked at Jonah, who was watching him with an expression that had been there since the barn in January, since the conversation about Finn sleeping through the night, an expression of a boy standing at the edge of something he wanted, but had learned to be careful about wanting frozen nut. He looked at Caleb, who was looking at the floor now, head down, shoulders slightly forward. He looked at Owen, who was watching him with that measuring gaze, the gaze that said, "I'm running the calculation. Tell me what goes in the variable." He looked at Finn. "That's up to your mother," Silas said, "and up to all of you. It's not a thing anyone gets to decide alone." Finn looked at his mother. She looked at Silas. Then she looked at her sons, all 4 of them, moving her gaze from one to the next, and whatever she saw in each of their faces was enough, because she said, "What do you want to call him?" Finn said, without missing a beat, "Silas." Jonah made the sound he made when Finn was correct in a way nobody could argue with. Caleb looked up from the floor. Owen uncrossed his arms. "Silas is fine," Silas said. Finn put his hat back on, indoors, and Evelyn looked at the ceiling and chose her battles. Aldrich shook hands all around and went back to his circuit. And Silas thought, watching the judge's wagon disappear down the ranch road, that Aldrich probably had 100 such afternoons in his memory ranch houses and front rooms and families assembled from unlikely materials, and that he probably didn't consider any of them ordinary, and was probably right not to. By October, the ranch had changed the way things change when enough people have moved through a space and left themselves in it. It was not a dramatic change. It was the accumulated change of a kitchen that had been reorganized to make sense, and a pantry that stayed stocked through winter because someone had planned for it, and a barn where the bridles hung on the correct nails, and the feed was measured with accuracy because a 14-year-old had memorized 43 tag numbers and took the inventory seriously. It was the change of a sewing room with a lamp in the window and mending on the table, and a south field with a kitchen garden that had produced, beyond anyone's expectation, enough to put by for winter. It was the change of 4 boys who had come off a train in December with the specific wariness of people who have been disappointed by places before, and who had since gradually, imperfectly, in the individual ways of their individual natures, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jonah sat with Silas over the accounts every week now. He had opinions about the spring sales strategy that were worth hearing, and Silas told him so, and the telling of it did not make the boy arrogant. It made him more careful, which was what it should have done. Caleb's weather notes had become a record going back 11 months, and he was beginning to see patterns in them that he hadn't been able to see with the almanac alone. He talked about them with the specific passion of a person who has found the thing they are meant to understand. And Silas listened to him the way you listen to someone who has genuinely got hold of something, which is with real attention, because real attention is what it deserves. Owen had redesigned the water routing from the well to the barn, a small thing but a functional one, and had explained the design to Silas with drawings and a clear account of why his routing used gravity to reduce pump work. He was right. Silas told him so. They built it in September, the 2 of them, and when it worked the way Owen said it would, Owen permitted himself a single satisfied nod and went to find the next problem. Finn turned 7 in October and was now tall enough to work the pump handle without standing on anything. He celebrated this achievement. At length, he had not had a nightmare in more than 8 months. There are people who will tell you that families are made of blood, and that love is a thing that arrives fully formed, or doesn't arrive at all, and that the domestic arrangement of 2 people who came together by accident and 4 boys who had no vote in any of it is something categorically different from the real thing. Those people have not spent a December learning to trust a house that did not turn them away. They have not sat at a kitchen table in January while a woman read an agency letter and chose, with full knowledge of the alternatives, to stay. They have not watched a 14-year-old boy allow himself to believe in April, carefully, with his whole history of not believing in things written clearly in his face. The truth about belonging is that it is not given. It is not found. It is built, the way Owen would build it, from measurements and attention, and the willingness to check the work before you commit your weight. It is built from the small, unspectacular choices that nobody writes down. The choice to stay up an extra hour and get the morning coffee on. The choice to say I'm afraid instead of I'm fine. The choice to open the door that has been closed for 3 years and let the room breathe again. Silas Mercer had not wanted a family. He had wanted a housekeeper and a functional pantry and someone who knew what they were doing in his kitchen before the worst of the Wyoming winter arrived. He had gotten all of those things. He had also gotten Jonah and his steady hands and his gift for numbers, and Caleb and his almanac and his careful, forward-facing mind, and Owen and his drawings and his instinct for the thing that was wrong before it broke, and Finn, who taught a bay mare to tolerate him by coming back every day until she forgot to be afraid. He had gotten Evelyn, who had sat across from him at his own kitchen table and asked, plainly, and without any guarantee of a decent answer, what he wanted. He had gotten the specific bravery of a woman who had been wrong once about something that mattered and had not let that make her into someone who stopped choosing. The ranch was the same land it had always been. The ridge was the same ridge. The north wind came from the same direction and found the same walls, and was, as it had always been, kept out. But the walls had people in them now. The warmth in them was not from any single fire, but from 8 months of accumulated living of suppers, as in storms, and arguments about almanac predictions, and a 6-year-old counting calves, and a boy asking if he could learn to ride in the spring, and a woman mending by the window in a room that had been closed too long. It was, Silas had come to understand the most ordinary kind of life. It was also, he had come to understand, the thing that everything else was in service of the commerce and the labor and the planning and the careful management of resources against the long Wyoming winter. All of it was in service of this, a house that held, and people in it who had chosen every day to stay. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was going gold across the south field. The garden was finished for the season, cleared and turned, and ready for what Caleb had already begun planning for spring. The horses were in the barn. The fence posts Owen had worried about were replaced. The ledger was current. Finn was outside, talking to the bay mare through the fence. She had her nose at the fence rail, listening. She had learned over 8 months that he always came back, and she had stopped, somewhere along the way, being afraid of that.